all of a sudden, the issue of scale moves off of the whiteboard from theory into practical reality. By being a single carbon market, it's more economically efficient, it's broader, and candidly, it lowers costs for the public. Washington State and Oregon are too small to go it alone, but if we link with California, all of a sudden the economic might and the influence on other regions around the planet becomes undeniable.
If Washington, D.C. is ceding leadership on climate, on the environment, how would the West Coast lead? That's the question we explore today with Reuven Carlyle, former Washington State Senator and architect of the state's Cap and Invest program. Reuven led the fight to put a price on pollution in Washington, modeled on California's system, and he's been at the forefront of conversations about how West Coast states could harmonize our climate strategies and maybe even work together. How will the West Coast lead on climate? Well, we already are. Not with strongly worded letters, but with concerted, innovative, market-based action. In this conversation, we talk about how West Coast states are pooling their power, collaborating with international partners, and pricing carbon, not just to lower emissions for cleaner air and water, but to build the sustainable economy of the future. I'm Greg Ammerfell, and this is Pacific Time, where we ask the big what-if questions about the West Coast future and explore the concrete ways we are taking control of our own destiny. Reuven dove in by explaining how California and Washington State, along with the Canadian province of Quebec, have co-developed the so-called Cap and Invest system, a homegrown approach to curtailing pollution and routing resources to help accelerate environmental progress.
Well, first of all, there's a long journey. The arc of climate action at the state level goes way back. And we've had initiatives in Washington State for a carbon tax. They were both summarily crushed. And I worked for a couple of years to introduce the legislation. Governor Gregoire back in 2009, along with State Representative Joe Fitzgibbon, soon after that got going on it. So there's a whole bunch of efforts that have happened. In California, those folks passed a very comprehensive bill called AB 32, and that was 10 plus years ago or 15 years ago now or something. The bottom line is it said, it was only 8 pages long. It said, we're going to create a state agency to go fight climate change using a market-based mechanism, go forth and do good. And off they went. So we have 10 years of data, 10 years of success and failure, 10 years of experience under the program, and then they reauthorized it. What California recently did was reauthorize their program. That sets the stage to link with the Washington program. Currently, California's program is actually linked with the Canadian province of Quebec. So California and Quebec are an alliance. So together, they're extremely successful and interesting and lots of background. And now Washington is in formal discussions with California and Quebec for the process of linkage, which would probably happen formally and technically in 2027. But the spirit of linkage exists. We are on the path together working toward a market-based mechanism to cap emissions and reinvest those dollars into quality of life and further climate action.
For me, for listeners, could you step back and explain what a market-based approach to managing emissions involves?
You bet. Absolutely. So a Cap and Invest program is actually an evidence-based global best practice. It is widely seen, and there's a ton of data on this, as the most economically efficient way to reduce emissions. You put a formal, firm cap on emissions, and then you slowly decline what the emission allowances, the amount of emissions allowed between now and 2050. It's really the spirit and the letter of the Paris Agreement, the spirit and the letter of net zero. So those polluters, those emitters have to purchase allowances to be able to emit. So if you're a large factory and you emit 25,000 metric tons or more per year, you have to purchase allowances. So very quickly, you have to make a business choice. Do we just continue to pollute and buy these allowances, or do we reinvest in our own infrastructure and reduce our emissions, like getting a new energy system, buying a new boiler, in taking care of our infrastructure more economically efficiently. So it's a really fabulous global best practice. It's widely seen as effective, and I think it's one policy that's actually bringing together a bit more the left and the right.
What's an analogy in the lives of consumers around the kinds of trade-offs you're describing?
What I've learned, Greg, is there's something incredibly powerful to talking up to people too, and not down to people. And I learned in this process that people are pretty smart. And the terminology in really economic terms is that today, pollution and emissions and dirty air and dirty water are not accounted for in the price of a product. So the public subsidizes pollution. In economics term, it's called a negative externality. There's a negative externality to pollution. So you socialize the cost of that product, making, Tide or Crest toothpaste or something, and you emit into the air. You socialize the cost, but you privatize the profit. Under cap and invest, all you're really doing is you're requiring the producer to account for the cost of pollution, the cost of carbon, the cost of emission in their own product. So it's really economically efficient. What's inefficient is when you don't account for pollution and you just have the public in the form of climate change or dirty air or dirty water pay the price. So Republicans and market-based folks actually really get it. And then on the left, a lot of those folks really get it because it actually reduces emissions.
By the way, I love the idea of talking up to people. On that note, can you explain, Reuven, how are cap and invest dollars being spent in Washington State and California right now?
One of the things and one of the luxuries that I had going into working politically to pass cap and invest in Washington was years of experience and data and insights from California and Quebec. So I went down to Sacramento. I met with a number of state senators and assembly members who I'm close with from various journeys of life and in my political work. And I listened deeply to their experience. And one of the most common themes that the California folks said was, in effect, they did all of this work to pass this legislation, and the state agency has tons of control over the spending. And in effect, politically, the legislators who did all the work sort of weren't getting the benefits. And so I learned at a very deep level that the right role for legislators, and for example, in the governor, rather than the technical mechanics of the program, was to stay focused on how to invest those dollars in high value ways that really benefit real people living real lives. Focusing in on the investment in communities. And so that's why I renamed the program Cap and Invest. Down in California, it was called Cap and Trade until a couple of weeks ago, where they renamed their program Cap and Invest. I ran into Governor Newsom during the campaign here last year and made the whole pitch to him, and he loved it. So I was actually super proud of that. It's not just renaming it, of course. That's a symbolic representation of the power of capping emissions and reinvesting in communities. So the way the dollars are invested in Washington is really driven by the concept of nexus. There has to be a nexus of value with the cost that the public is paying and businesses are paying into high value investments that really affect people. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One is new ferries, hybrid and electric ferries. We have the largest ferry system in the United States here in Washington State throughout Puget Sound. It's part of the DNA and the soul. We get millions of tourists a year. And of course, people rely upon it to get to the islands and live there. But ultimately, they're also the largest emitter of diesel fuel in state government. And so the ability to decarbonize and modernize our fleet. A second use of proceeds is free transit for young people. Every young person, 18 and younger, in Washington State can hop on any bus, any train, and any ferry for free. We believe in making young people connected to transit and transportation and just eliminating the barriers. Another category is salmon fish culverts. So basically the infrastructure that allows the clearing of blocked culverts for salmon. Now, some people may say, well, that's not a climate issue or that's not reducing emissions further. And it's not directly reducing emissions. But for the Pacific Northwest, salmon are the spiritual soul of our economy, of our quality of life. And we are losing salmon and we are losing the orcas that feed on them, and the whole ecosystem is in danger. So I believe it's climate mitigation. There's mitigation in terms of reduction of emissions, but there's also adaptation. And adaptation to a changing environment really matters. So salmon restoration. Then we have charging infrastructure at multifamily housing all over the state being rolled out. We have medium and heavy duty trucks, those big 18-wheeler trucks that they get 4 miles per gallon of diesel. They sit there and they idle all day long. Tesla has come out with a new truck that's getting ready to go to production, which has a 500-mile range, which takes about 30 minutes to charge and costs less than a diesel truck. The marketplace is moving. And what's so powerful about Cap and Invest is that it aligns policy with market forces. And that's where you see action. So those investments in quality of life also touch on clean air and clean water. We really have a monitoring of our particulate matter so that we can clean up our air around point areas, like large factories, and really be in tune with the impact on a neighborhood. And then we're putting a lot of money into wildfire mitigation and wildfire forest management practices. So those are 5 or 6 categories where we're spending the Cap and Invest money.
Those are really helpful examples, and they're very concrete. As someone who rides the ferries, as someone who has teenagers riding transit, as someone who enjoys salmon and has friends working in salmon habitat restoration, as someone who's sensitive to wildfire in Washington and California and Oregon, those all seem very concrete and very related to climate. I see what you mean about linking to policy. Well, on the subject of linking, Reuven, so you've just been in California, working with California legislative leadership to reauthorize their now Cap and Invest program. What are the pros and cons of linking with California?
So California is the 4th largest economy in the world. The number one thing that people said when there was an initiative to try to repeal Washington's Cap and Invest on the ballot last year, the number one criticism is we're too small. We're just one state. Why should the people of Washington pay a cost when no one else is? But with linking with California and Quebec, we create not only one of the largest emission trading systems, which is what a Cap and Invest is, in the world, along with the EU, but we also deepen the alignment of the West Coast. And that, I think, is about values. That's about economic interests. I mean, look, Seattle punches above its weight. We're the global headquarters of Amazon, Microsoft, Starbucks, Boeing, Costco, PACCAR, T-Mobile, you name it. And we really show up. California, of course, has pure might and size and economic influence. When you start to link together the market leaders and the policy leadership, all of a sudden you recognize that the old economy, the extraction economy of timber and of maritime and aviation and long-haul trucking, all of a sudden it becomes connected to the future economy, like energy storage and grid modernization and the ability to scale distributed energy systems. So, for example, the investment in linking our markets opens the door to scale around battery storage. It opens the door to scale regarding a modernization of the grid so that these data centers or electric charging infrastructure, all of a sudden they can have their own energy systems. We could use geothermal more economically efficiently. We could use, I would argue, for small modular nuclear is an important part of our future. All of a sudden, the issue of scale moves off of the whiteboard from theory into practical reality. By being a single carbon market, it's more economically efficient, it's broader, and candidly, it lowers costs for the public. Washington State and Oregon are too small to go it alone, but if we link with California, all of a sudden the economic might and the influence on other regions around the planet becomes undeniable.
Are there any downsides to linking up what's happening in the Northwest to what's happening in California?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there's a certain unpredictability that comes with being aligned with such a big tiger. I will say that politically, in terms of governance, Quebec, which is about 11 million people, very similar to Washington and Oregon, and as a hydro province, they have timber industry, they have First Nations, tribal issues like we do in a really positive way. So their experience is that they are one-to-one partners with California. California does not make a major policy decision without Quebec. So I think that if you think about it from a democratic point of view, with a small d, we're not minority shareholders here, where we just have a tag along role. So we're equal and full partners at a policy level. So I do think that there's potential downsides in terms of the unpredictability of scale.
What are some examples of those?
Well, let's say that if you look at the energy needs of California and you look at their energy needs in terms of the rolling blackouts of years ago that they have, would there be any implications if it's more economically efficient for the energy producers up here to send energy down to California rather than help decarbonize our own industry up here? I'm not saying this is only cap and invest. This is sort of a much at a higher level, a little bit at altitude, at a policy level, because our energy system is not directly exclusively about cap, but it is sort of a symbolic representation that deeper interconnectedness of some of our infrastructure touches on, how to make sure we're doing it in an effective way.
Is the revenue going to grow more unpredictable as we become part of a bigger market?
I'm so glad you asked that. That really goes to the core of it. So California allowance prices, the price of their pollution credits effectively, currently are in the mid-20s. In Washington State, we're in the low 60s. We have a very tight cap on emissions, and they have a bit of a looser cap. But their reauthorization is tightening their cap. So here's what's likely to happen. I think the financial markets, the analysts, the Wall Street investors, which are only a portion of this market, but I think the markets are pricing in A, an expectation of linkage, and B, an expectation that California's prices will rise a bit and Washington's will come down a bit. It's just a broader market. So I think it is likely to stabilize prices. But what I like about your question is it gets to the core of something I feel very strongly about. The power and the magic and the policy here is not to raise money. The policy is to cap and reduce emissions. This is a climate bill that happens to raise capital that can be reinvested in public good. It is not a tax bill. It has revenue implications, but I feel strongly that the goal of the policy is to put itself out of business. So between now and 2050, if we reduce emissions to the point where no one has to continue buying allowances and the prices fall apart, it means, God forbid, we actually achieved our climate goal, we actually reduced emissions, and it worked. It's the only government program that I hope puts itself out of business in an economically efficient way by actually working. I mean, of course, I hope there's other programs too, but
it would be a good day if in 20, 30 years, this carbon market no longer exists.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we have to have the courage and we have to have the humility to say that. The goal is not to get addicted to more dollars flowing only. The goal is to stay focused on the climate work of reducing emissions.
Right.
And transitioning to a lower carbon economy. That's the work. It isn't saying that all emissions are inherently bad. It's saying that they're not economically efficient and that there's ways to transition to a lower carbon economy using less fossil fuels, less carbon intense fuels, and electrifying those things that can be electrified, which isn't everything.
Yeah. So an aspect of the policy design here I find so interesting is that this money isn't flowing in to fund schools. It's really targeted at the very environmental and climate related actions that are part of a transition that would put the whole cap and invest system out of business if successful.
That's right.
Is Oregon coming online? Are states in the Northeast coming online? Are Michigan and Wisconsin and Illinois coming online? What are the prospects for growth in this cap and invest movement, Reuven?
So I think the public can really understand, and your listeners, I think, are deeply attuned to this, that we live in a moment where states have never been more important. In many ways, it was the Dobbs decision on choice. It was the question of election integrity. It was a number of issues that sort of woke the public up to a deeper understanding of the unique role in our constitutional republic of states. And of course, the brilliance of our system, most of all, is a system of checks and balances. That's been upended by the Trump administration. So state level action has never mattered more. Regional cooperation has never mattered more. And ultimately, we're in a moment where states are big enough to be impactful, but small enough to get things done. I mean, I don't think Congress can't hardly pass a bill to declare apple pie month with any kind of consensus. And, we really matter at the state level. The beauty of cap and invest and other climate policies that are evidence-based global best practices, like low carbon fuel standard for transportation and the built environment policies around buildings and many others, is that you don't have to be geographically linked. So Quebec, which is on the east coast of Canada, is a unique province in many ways, of course, French speaking, but ultimately a deep alignment with the values of sustainability and the values of circularity and the values of renewable energy and many others. So they linked up with California. I think that the European Union is moving forward on their emission trading system. They already have one on the industrial base. They're now expanding it to include transportation, which is what Cap and Invest here in the US covers. So Oregon literally was on the phone yesterday with Senator Janine Solman, the chair of the Energy Committee in the Oregon State Senate. She is deeply invested in this work. They have a long history of having tried it and failed. People may remember the walkout of Republicans from their legislature a few years ago. That was all over this legislation. But now they are reassessing it since California and Washington have moved forward. 90%, in my experience, of painting a house is scraping and sanding and taping. It's the prep work. They are doing the scraping and the sanding and the taping. They are thinking deeply about whether this is the moment. And if you can imagine a West Coast alliance that could be very impactful.
You brought up the subject of states asserting their strength and their ability to make rapid decisions. But, part of what's going on is we're seeing a shift in the dynamics between the federal government and the states under the Trump administration. They have made very active moves to de-emphasize climate and environment and renewable energy. I mean, I think yesterday Trump referred to the quote unquote, green energy scam or something along those lines. And we've also seen the EPA withdraw its greenhouse gas judgment that enabled a lot of environmental legislation. Is federal hostility getting in the way of anything that the West Coast might consider doing?
It is getting in the way of our democracy. It is getting in the way of climate action. It's getting in the way of healthcare. It is absolutely a factor. At the same time, the science hasn't changed one bit. Our need to decarbonize is not disconnected from our values of economic growth and opportunity for people. Economic growth and carbon emissions are not joined at the hip. They don't have to be. They can be decoupled. So candidly, Trump brings chaos. It brings uncertainty. It brings a lack of a federal partner and, of course, open hostility. But real companies that are committed to this work are still doing the work. They're just doing it quietly. State governments that are committed to this work are generally continuing it. They're just doing it more quietly. Investors are investing in geothermal, in small modular nuclear, in regenerative agriculture, in maritime decarbonization, sustainable aviation fuel, built environment, weatherization. Every one of these areas are continuing at the speed of light. The cost of solar is down over 90+% in 20 years. It is the most efficient form of energy. Does it mean it's perfect and it replaces natural gas everywhere? Of course not. There's a role for natural gas as a peaker fuel and others. But wind, hydro, solar, small modular nuclear, geothermal. These are all continuing. It's just people are sensitive to the political vulnerabilities associated with a hostile federal government. So I'm not minimizing it for a New York second, but the science hasn't changed. And if you believe in long-term fiduciary investing and you're a hedge fund manager, or a pension fund investor, or the Oregon or Washington State Investment Board, or BlackRock, you're still investing in the transition to a lower carbon economy because that's where the value is.
So certainly it's upsetting to see the Trump administration back away from anything close to leadership on climate. But I also, in what you're saying, Reuven, wonder if we really need it. Like if it's highlighting that the federal government's role in actual moves to mitigate and respond to and adapt to climate change and to keep the environment clean is all that necessary, whether we can act on our own without federal involvement.
I don't want to minimize the impact of the hostility out of Washington, D.C. It is detrimental and it is dangerous and it is destructive. At the same time, the obligation to facilitate this transition to a lower carbon and regenerative economy and to embrace circularity, the guiding principles of all of this remain. And climate change is happening. We can pretend like it's not because it's not politically popular right now, but that doesn't change the science by 1 millimeter of anything. So yes, it's chaos and we have to keep going. I will say the premier companies in the world have overwhelmingly embraced many of them have embraced the work of sort of growing in a lower carbon way.
So what other policy areas related to climate, but beyond climate, Reuven, do you think are ripe for additional collaboration between West Coast states and other coalition partners and other folks that share our values?
The example that everyone is pretty familiar with recently, of course, is the healthcare collaborative between California, Oregon, and Washington and Hawaii. I would suggest that climate, when you think about the impact of climate on Hawaii, if you think about the Southwest in terms of New Mexico as an oil extraction economy, if you think about California, Oregon, Washington, if you think about British Columbia, but also some of the other Canadian provinces, as I mentioned, like Quebec, but candidly, the European Union, if you think about the commitment to renewable energy, that is not dependent upon Russian oil in terms of the Ukraine war. If you think about the commitment to offshore wind off of Norway and the other Nordic countries, if you think about offshore wind relative to Africa and off the coast of Spain and Portugal, incredible opportunities. So there are places around the world where the global best practices of wind, hydro, solar, small modular nuclear, other geothermal, other energy sources are moving at the speed of light. People are not slowing down. So the hostility of the Trump administration is not global climate policy. And it's not local climate policy. It is the chaos that it is. We will make it through this time. We have 3.5 more years. We will make it through this time. And maybe there'll be continued hostility and maybe there won't. But I'll tell you what, if I was the governor of Florida, or if I was the governor of Texas, I think you're kidding yourself if you can pretend like the inability of homeowners in your state to get homeowners insurance because of the impacts of climate. If you think that's a joke, good luck getting reelected. If you mock the issue of insurance, if you don't understand that insurance is a climate issue, there's very few companies or industry sectors that are more in tune with the long-term risks of climate than the ultra-conservative insurance industry. They get it. They got hundreds of people in back room using AI, using data modeling, and they know what the heck they're doing. And they are doing predictive analytics regarding all of the modeling. So if you're in Florida, if you're in Texas, if you're in Alabama, if you're in Louisiana, if you're the Gulf Coast, and if you're in California and other states, the impact is not trivial. There are big companies as well as residential developments that can't open warehouses, that can't open industrial parks because there isn't water. The nexus between water and climate is profound and serious and important. So to me, the real answer is water and energy and climate is the work of our time. And states, I think, understand that because they touch real people living real lives in local communities. A lot of these red states they use the emergency management. They use the FEMA response because of these hurricanes. At some point, people start to connect the dots. What is happening here? What's happening is impact of climate worldwide.
Gosh, so many threads. You mentioned water and energy. Are those two areas that represent a lot more opportunity for collaboration between West Coast states and perhaps even our, partners to the north?
Without question. I mean, water is one of the spiritual souls of connected communities, and the relationship between Canada, which of course is the headwaters of Columbia that comes down into Washington, but the nexus with water quality, acidification, marine life, all of the issues are well known in the West. And I think, the old joke we know, of course, is that, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. It's just all about governance structures, and it really matters. So the West, we're familiar with it. Folks out East aren't as familiar with the intimacy of water issues and water rights, but water is a climate issue. Climate issue is a water issue. The era of mindless use of water in various sectors without understanding the impact from climate is simply well over.
Let me shift gears in a couple ways. First of all, just the political strategy. I mean, Reuven, you operated in the Washington State Senate. You've been working with legislative leaders in California. You articulate a beautiful vision of what climate collaboration could look like. And yet the brass tacks of politics, you have to roll up your sleeves and get ready to rumble on that stuff. How are the political realities evolving right now under the Trump administration?
Again, I think state level action is seen as more imperative than ever. The California legislature and Governor Newsom reauthorized their cap and invest program. Oregon is very serious about it. Washington has moved forward and has been defended by. So we know that there's movement here. The European Union is moving forward. I mean, we as we said, we really know that there's this global opportunity for leadership. At the same time, what does it take for governors and legislators around the country to embrace this work and to find opportunities for collaboration? I think a lot of them feel like they're putting out the proverbial forest fires from the Trump administration on healthcare and on Medicaid and on infrastructure funding, which hasn't been aligned with what he campaigned on at all. But these cuts at the federal level are going to have profound implications. And of course, I don't think it's irrelevant to point out that most blue states are net contributors of federal dollars, and most red states are net recipients of federal dollars. So the anti-government sentiment from some red states that says, get government out of our way and, sort of follows that narrative is disconnected from the financial reality where most money flows from the blue sector to the red sector. And that's why I think on some very deep level, we have to recognize sort of Barack Obama's central vision, which is just so many ways and excuses we can find ourselves going down this hole of misalignment and disconnect, or we can choose to be one nation and to get aligned. And I think this is that moment. And I think climate, of course, is so profoundly existential, and it's an economic opportunity. The idea that climate action is only a cost and only a burden and only a negative impact on affordability is wrong. It's the greatest market and economic opportunity of our generation, of our time, of this era. It's an opportunity, not just a cost. That's our theory of change at my company, Earth Finance, that I started. That was my theory of change politically and at policy level. And I just think the alternative is to fracture, disconnection, rage, and lack of alignment on tackling the issues that are raised by climate.
And that's what I want to drill into a little bit on the politics of this, because, hey, on the West Coast, we are democratically controlled in the governor's offices and in the legislatures. And yet there's still an art to building coalitions to get important policy done, working with across urban and rural lines, working across economic lines, working with tribes, working with different ethnic and racial groups. What is the art of getting stuff done on the West Coast these days, Reuven?
I think the art is having the courage to step back and to operate at the right altitude, at a higher altitude. The challenges that we face around healthcare and climate and educational quality and affordability and economic opportunity for young people and housing affordability, these issues go to the soul of quality of life. It really matters. So I think we have to bring folks together. I mean, the hardest thing in politics is say no to your friends. That's the hard part. And I think Democrats have sort of become the party of government instead of the party of government action. I mean, Ezra Klein's podcast and book with Derek Thompson on abundance, I subscribe deeply to that vision that we have to show that blue states can govern, that policies and programs that were designed to protect the public shouldn't just become massive obstacles and barriers. So I think the West Coast and Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, others, as cities as well as states, we have a lot to show that we can govern with intentionality, but we can move forward. I don't think we're doing a great job at that. I'm not saying red states are doing it right, but I'll give an example. The federal and national electrification dollars under Biden that got out the door overwhelmingly were deployed in red states. And in 6-12 months, they rolled out charging stations left and right. Blue states, and as a general cliche, categorically failed. We set up task forces, studies, and commissions, and we did community outreach and, about whether or not we should set up a charging system in the middle of nowhere, on a highway somewhere. Just do it. And I think government under Democratic leadership has lost a passion for quality, a passion for efficiency. I used to joke in political times when I was at the Rotary, I wished Democrats cared more about efficiency and Republicans cared more about equity. Like, we have to find a pathway. So there's a lot of governing to do, but we have to do it with more intentionality regarding quality. And I think this is where Democrats have lost a lot of credibility. And not that Republicans are showing up with the right answer, but I think having the humility to talk to the public in a genuine way about making government programs work. My guiding view is that until Democrats look the public in the eye and say, I want you to know that every penny that you send in tax dollars to the state capital, that we're going to reinvest that in high quality of life investments that matter, whether it's climate or healthcare or education or housing. And we're going to treat it like our own instead of treating it like an entitlement. And I think that's one of the challenges of our time.
Yeah, you mentioned Ezra Klein and the abundance narrative. I heard a really interesting conversation with Ezra on Gavin Newsom's podcast. Klein was holding Newsom to task for the housing affordability crisis in California. And, lo and behold, a few months later, California passed legislation to relax some of its, by the way, Republican originated environmental quality initiatives in order to accelerate housing development. But that to me is a good example of the kind of trade-offs. I mean, these things aren't all perfectly clean. There are trade-offs to be made in order to address the problems of our time. So I think what you're saying is, hey, while we can all worry about the nature of the way that the Trump administration is operating, there's something to acknowledge in their fast pace and forward progress that blue cities, blue states could really take on in trying to address a number of our key challenges at one time.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And of course, outside of housing, the other obvious example is renewable energy. The ability to build a large renewable energy facility in the West Coast is just paralyzed. It takes years. There's opposition, and the opposition sometimes is perfect as the enemy of the good, and sometimes it's legitimate. And we have to be deeply invested in tribes and others who have constitutional rights and treaty rights. I agree with all that. And that doesn't have to inherently be inconsistent with action and moving forward and the public good. I think it comes down to having a deep sense of humility, how you engage with the public. And instead of pretending like it's all rosy, let's acknowledge when things work and let's acknowledge when they don't. I mean, the sense of energy and passion that comes from looking the public in the eye and saying this program does not work, has not delivered, we should cancel it and we should try again another time, or we should reform it. That's not anti-government. It's pro-public. It's pro-taxpayer. It's, really, it's the right thing to do. So there's an old line in politics that says good public policy is good politics. And I think sometimes we've lost that. And I'm not just critical only of blue cities and blue states, but I think like Ezra Klein, all of us can say, let's just absolutely embrace the humility of this moment and let's acknowledge when things work. Let's acknowledge when they don't. And let's look at climate and sustainability work as an opportunity for constructive quality of life action. Think about the tactical example of waste reduction, right? We're so afraid of asking the public to recycle more, but let's make the bins available instead of making it a big deal and setting out, just in Europe, you go to Copenhagen, you walk out, there's 4 separate recycle bins, and you're just expected to follow the damn rules. But in that, your cost of that circularity, goes down. You get benefits. You get a reduction on your utility bill. So just let's make a social contract with the public on some of these things.
Interesting. And it goes back to your point about talking up to people. So much of our political tone and tenor is so cynical because it assumes that people can't take on nuanced arguments. And, there you go. Turns out humans are very capable of figuring out which of the 4 recycling bins to use if it's clear and they have good reason to.
Right. But also it's okay if we say that folks who, the cost of providing a recycling infrastructure, in far, far rural, remote part of the state, maybe there's a better use of public money or of, public good. Doesn't mean that absolutely everybody has to be a monolith in the United States. And that's where I think a lot of rural folks get really frustrated. It's like, look, there's no buses out here. Don't force us to ride it. Let's figure it out. So allowing that local quality of life and that local connection doesn't mean that what's right for downtown Seattle is right for Omak, Washington.
Throughout this conversation, Reuven, the subtext has been, we're talking about gathering the resources and funds to tackle important problems. You brought up the idea that California and Washington are 2 of the leading donor states. That we pay more in federal tax than we get back. And in fact, we're starting to get back even less than we had. Do you have any ideas for how we could recoup some of our federal tax investment?
That's something I think a lot of people are pondering. And, I think the congressional delegations are spending a lot of time thinking about that. We're the economic engine of the country in terms of some of these key blue states. And that's an honor and that's a privilege. Instead of seeing it as a battle and we're just fighting for a bigger piece of the pie, I do think it's legitimate to say, what are ways that we can continue to evolve so that we're creating economic opportunity and wealth for our own communities at a time when the federal government has withdrawn as a legitimate partner, when they've withdrawn their sense of obligation. So I think Cap and Invest is a symbolic example of that. It is generating revenue for high value reasons, but reinvesting those dollars in our quality of life is really important. So as you said at the beginning, I think it's a great example of it. I think we should explore other examples. What are ways that we can generate economic activity locally so that we get the multiplier effect at a local level? We're going to pay federal taxes unless the country splits up. We're going to continue to be obligated to that. Which of course we don't want, but in any way, that kind of chaos. But I do think that we have to step back and explore that question very deeply. What are the best practices around the country and around the world where we can increase and improve the quality of our local investments? And Washington is a trade-dependent state, so we are international by nature. It's part of our DNA, and that's a good thing. We're a day closer to Asia than San Francisco by ship because of our latitude. We're the home of aviation, maritime. We've got long-haul trucking, PACCAR's headquartered here. We're exploring new energy sources. So the value of those high-quality economic sectors is unmistakable. We are a global community, and I think Washington is a representation of that. So we're going to have to navigate this difficult time.
I came away from this conversation with Reuven Carlyle fired up, excited. So what did we learn today? That carbon pricing isn't just an abstract economic tool. It's a way to take power back from polluters without obstructing industry, and in ways that make it possible to reinvest in our communities, to set up a flywheel of forward progress on one of our biggest challenges in climate change. That West Coast states have the scale and ingenuity to lead if we choose to coordinate rather than compete, and that real governing, is still possible even in polarized times if we build unlikely coalitions and keep our eyes on the future. Share this episode with a friend, colleague, or family member. You know the one, the person who never has a good thing to say about government. Ask them if a policy that sets up a market to lower pollution and raises money specifically to lower pollution even faster, ask if that sounds like a good idea. Post your thoughts. Ask them to post theirs at Pacific Time Podcast on YouTube, Substack, Instagram, Facebook, or Blue Sky. And while you're at it, encourage those friends to listen, follow, and share wherever you get your podcasts. Let's keep the conversation alive, because the carbon clock is ticking and so many other issues are urgent, and because we've barely tapped the creativity and courage that comes naturally to us on the left coast. Thanks for being with me in Pacific Time. This is Greg Emmerfell, and I'll see you next time.